A packed university auditorium fell silent when Professor Richard Ellison leaned into the microphone and said, "Sir, with respect, that story never happened." Every student turned toward Thomas Whitaker, an 86-year-old veteran sitting alone in the front row. His weathered hands rested on a worn leather satchel. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the professor and said, "I was there." The room erupted with nervous laughter. Ellison smiled. "You claim a secret extraction mission rescued 23 men behind enemy lines in 1968. There is no record of it. Not one." Thomas slowly opened his satchel and removed a faded strip of cloth covered in handwritten coordinates. The professor held it up for everyone to see. "This," he scoffed, "this isn't evidence. It's a souvenir." For a moment, Thomas stared at the cloth. The bright auditorium lights seemed to fade. Rain-soaked jungle, rotor blades chopping through the darkness. A wounded pilot screaming for help. Blood on his hands as he scribbled those coordinates under enemy fire. Then the memory vanished. Back in the auditorium, the professor tossed the cloth onto the table. "Stories grow larger with age," he said. "That's how myths are born." But in the back row, graduate student Emily Carter froze. She recognized the markings. 3 letters. R-H-17. She had seen that code once before in a restricted archive catalog. Without saying a word, she snapped a photo and sent it to a contact at the National Military Archives. 10 minutes later, while the professor continued dismantling Thomas's story in front of hundreds of people, a phone rang in an office nearly 1,000 miles away. Colonel James Harrington looked at the image on his screen and went pale. "Get me the Raven Hollow files," he ordered. Minutes later, another message arrived. Then another. Names, reports, coordinates, signatures. The room was still laughing when a black government vehicle pulled up outside the university. 2 uniformed officers stepped out carrying a sealed archive case. Inside were documents that had been hidden for decades. And at the bottom of the first report was a single name that made everyone stop breathing. Thomas Whitaker. The professor's smile disappeared. The officers opened the file. The first page hit the table. And what they found next would change everything. "Sir, with respect, that story never happened." The words landed with the sharp certainty of a judge delivering a verdict, and for a moment, the entire auditorium seemed to stop breathing. More than 300 people sat beneath the bright white lights of Jefferson State University's History Symposium, their attention fixed on the elderly man in the front row. Thomas Whitaker did not move. At 86 years old, he sat with both hands resting on a worn leather satchel that looked older than many of the students surrounding him. His gray suit was simple. His tie was slightly crooked. Nothing about him suggested importance. Nothing about him suggested that the room would remember his name before the day was over. Professor Richard Ellison stood confidently beside the stage podium. He was one of the most respected military historians in the country, a man whose books filled university libraries across America. His silver-framed glasses reflected the glow of the projector behind him. On the massive screen was a slide titled Myth and Memory in Vietnam War Narratives. The audience trusted him. Why wouldn't they? For 30 years, he had built a career separating fact from fiction. And at this moment, Thomas Whitaker had become the example. Ellison folded his hands calmly. "Mr. Whitaker claims he participated in a covert extraction mission in 1968 that rescued 23 stranded personnel from hostile territory. An extraordinary story." A few students nodded. Others leaned forward. "The problem," Ellison continued, "is that there is absolutely no historical evidence this operation ever occurred." A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. Thomas remained silent. He had learned long ago that silence often carried more weight than arguments. The professor paced slowly across the stage. No official reports. No declassified records. No mission logs. Nothing. The giant screen changed to another slide. More dates. More references. More documentation. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Thomas Whitaker's story should not exist. "Memory is powerful," Ellison said. "But memory is not proof." Several students scribbled notes. Others exchanged knowing smiles. To them, the conclusion already seemed obvious. An old veteran remembering events differently than history recorded them. It was a familiar academic discussion. The professor stopped directly in front of Thomas. "Sir," he said politely, "I am not questioning your sincerity. I simply believe your recollection has been shaped by time. The room grew quiet. Every eye turned toward the old man. Thomas slowly lifted his gaze. His pale blue eyes showed no anger, no embarrassment, no frustration, only a calmness that felt strangely out of place. I was there, he said. The words were soft, yet somehow they carried to the back of the auditorium. Ellison offered a sympathetic smile. And yet history disagrees. A few students laughed quietly. Thomas lowered his eyes again and opened the satchel resting on his lap. The leather creaked softly. From inside, he removed a folded strip of faded cloth. The fabric was stained by age, its edges worn and frayed from decades of handling. He placed it carefully on the table beside him. The professor looked down at it with curiosity. And what exactly is this? Thomas studied the cloth for a moment before answering. The only copy I ever kept. The auditorium fell silent once more. Ellison picked up the cloth between two fingers and unfolded it. Across the surface were handwritten numbers and letters faded almost beyond recognition. The professor examined it briefly before shaking his head. Then he looked toward the audience and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, holding it up beneath the bright lights, "this is not an archive. This is a souvenir." The laughter was brief. Not loud enough to be cruel, but loud enough to sting. It drifted through the auditorium like a cold draft slipping beneath a locked door. Professor Richard Ellison lowered the faded cloth onto the table and dusted his hands together as though the discussion had already been settled. Behind him, the projector continued to glow against the giant screen, washing the stage in pale blue light. The slides still displayed dates, references, and official records. Facts, documents, evidence, everything academia trusted, everything the old man apparently did not have. Stories survive because people want to believe them, Ellison said as he walked slowly across the stage. That is human nature. Several students nodded. A few professors seated near the front folded their arms with quiet satisfaction. The lecture had returned to familiar ground. Thomas Whitaker sat motionless. His satchel remained open beside his chair. The worn cloth lay where the professor had left it. He made no attempt to defend himself, no attempt to convince anyone. His silence only seemed to strengthen Ellison's confidence. The challenge with oral history, the professor continued, is that memory changes over time. Details disappear. Events merge together. Sometimes entirely new events are created without the person even realizing it. More notes were scribbled across notebooks and tablets. The audience was listening carefully now, not because of Thomas, but because they trusted the man standing at the podium. After all, Richard Ellison had built his reputation on evidence. Thomas had only brought a piece of cloth. Near the middle rows, however, one person was no longer listening to the lecture. Emily Carter stared at the faded coordinates projected on the overhead screen. The image had appeared only briefly when the professor displayed the cloth for the audience. Most people had ignored the markings completely. Emily could not. Something about them felt familiar. She leaned forward. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. 3 small characters sat near one edge of the fabric. Faded. Nearly invisible. RH-17. She had seen that code before. Not in a book. Not in a museum. Somewhere else. Somewhere buried deep inside a digital archive she had accessed during a graduate research project the previous year. The memory lingered just beyond reach. Emily quickly opened her laptop. The glow of the screen reflected in her glasses as she searched through old research notes. Nothing appeared immediately. She searched again, then again. Across the room, Professor Ellison was dismantling Thomas's account piece by piece. If such a mission existed, he said, there would be documentation. Military organizations create records for everything. Records survive. That is how history works. A wave of agreement moved through the audience. Thomas looked toward the large American flag standing beside the stage. The fabric hung perfectly still. His expression never changed. Emily finally found an old folder from her archive project. She opened it. Hundreds of scanned references appeared. Most were meaningless. Then her eyes landed on a classification index she had nearly forgotten. Her breath caught. There it was. RH-17. The exact same code. For several seconds, she simply stared at the screen. Then she glanced toward Thomas Whitaker. The old veteran remained alone beneath the bright lights while an entire room questioned his memory. Emily looked back at the code. A note attached to the index contained only 6 words. Restricted military archive. Access suspended by request. Her stomach tightened. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone, took a photograph of the cloth displayed on the screen, and sent it to the only person she knew who might understand what she was seeing. Then she waited. And nearly 800 miles away, a phone began to ring. The ringing phone echoed through a quiet office lined with steel cabinets and decades of military records. Morning sunlight spilled through a narrow window, painting long rectangles across the floor. Colonel James Harrington had been reviewing routine archive requests when the notification appeared on his screen. Normally, he would have ignored it. Graduate students submitted inquiries every day. Most led nowhere. This one was different. The photograph loaded slowly. A faded strip of cloth. Handwritten coordinates. Age-worn fabric. Nothing remarkable at first glance. Then Harrington saw the marking. R. H. -17. His hand froze above the keyboard. The room suddenly felt smaller. For several seconds he did not move. He simply stared. Then he reached for the phone. "Get me the Raven Hollow Classification Index," he said. The response came immediately. "Sir, that archive remains restricted." Harrington's expression hardened. "I know exactly what it is. Open it." Back at Jefferson State University, Professor Richard Ellison continued speaking with the confidence of a man who believed history had already delivered its verdict. The audience remained captivated. Every chart, every document, every reference reinforced his argument. Thomas Whitaker listened quietly. The old veteran seemed completely detached from the debate unfolding around him. His eyes rested on the cloth lying on the table. The faded numbers stared back at him like old friends. Friends whose names few people remembered anymore. Ellison clicked to another slide. More records appeared on the giant screen. "Historical truth survives because documentation survives," he explained. "Without evidence, stories become legends. Legends become myths." The audience nodded again. The logic felt impossible to challenge. Near the center aisle, Emily Carter checked her phone for the 5th time. Nothing. Her message remained unread. Doubt began creeping into her mind. Perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps the code was a coincidence. Perhaps Professor Ellison was right after all. Then her screen suddenly lit up. One message. From an unfamiliar government address. Her pulse quickened. The message contained only 4 words. "Where is Thomas Whitaker?" Emily stared at the screen. Another notification arrived almost immediately. Then another. The sender was requesting confirmation. Location. Time. Event details. The urgency was unmistakable. Emily looked toward the stage. The professor was still dismantling the story piece by piece. Thomas remained silent. She typed a quick response and pressed send. 800 miles away, Colonel Harrington stood in front of a secure archive room as a heavy door unlocked with a mechanical click. Cold air drifted from inside. Rows of sealed storage cases stretched into the shadows. Harrington moved directly toward a shelf near the back. His assistant hurried beside him. "Sir, what exactly are we looking for?" Harrington stopped. He ran a finger across a label covered in dust. Raven Hollow. The name had not been spoken publicly in decades. "We are looking," Harrington said quietly, "for something that was never supposed to disappear." He lifted the case from the shelf. The metal container felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its weight, because of what it contained. Back at the university, Thomas slowly folded his hands together. The lecture hall lights hummed softly overhead. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the autumn sky. Inside, nobody noticed the black government sedan that had just entered the campus parking lot. Nobody except the security officer watching the front gate. And when he saw the federal credentials on the vehicle, his expression changed instantly. The security officer watched the sedan roll past the gate and felt a chill he could not explain. Universities received visitors every day. Donors, speakers, alumni. This was different. The vehicle carried no university permit, no campus markings, and no hesitation. It moved with the quiet confidence of people who already knew where they were going. Inside the auditorium, nobody noticed. Professor Richard Ellison stood beneath the glow of the projector, completely in command of the room. His voice carried easily through the hall. "The danger of unverified stories is not malicious intent," he explained. "Most people genuinely believe what they remember." He clicked to another slide. Charts appeared. Dates. References. Footnotes. The language of certainty. The audience followed every word. Several students were already typing excerpts into their laptops. Others recorded clips on their phones. The symposium would likely be shared across academic circles by evening. A respected historian had publicly dismantled a famous veteran's story. It was exactly the kind of moment people remembered. Thomas Whitaker remained silent. The old cloth rested on the table beside him. His fingers lightly touched its edge, not gripping it, not protecting it, simply resting there, as though the fabric connected him to a place nobody else in the room could see. Across the aisle, Emily Carter's phone vibrated again. She glanced down. Another message. This one was longer. Her eyes widened as she read it. Confirm visual identity. White male. Approximately 86 years old. Name Thomas Whitaker. Present at your location? Emily swallowed. She typed a single word. Yes. The response came almost instantly. Do not let him leave. Her pulse quickened. She looked toward Thomas. The old veteran appeared completely unaware of the attention now converging around him. Or perhaps he knew and simply did not care. Professor Ellison stepped closer to the front of the stage. History survives because records survive, he said. When records do not exist, responsible historians must ask difficult questions. The audience nodded. The logic seemed unbreakable. Then a faint memory surfaced in Thomas's mind. Not because of the professor's words, but because of the smell drifting from somewhere nearby. Coffee. Fresh coffee. For a brief moment, the auditorium disappeared. He remembered a humid morning long ago. A folding map spread across a metal table. The scent of coffee mixing with damp paper. Men studying coordinates. Quiet voices. Careful planning. Nobody raising their voice because everyone understood the stakes. The memory lingered only a second before fading away. Back in the present, Thomas blinked and looked toward the stage. The years had changed many things. The feeling of that morning had not changed at all. Meanwhile, across campus, the black sedan came to a stop outside the administration building. Two men stepped out wearing dark suits. Neither carried a briefcase. Neither looked around. One spoke briefly into a phone before both entered the building. Minutes later, the university president received an unexpected call from Washington. The conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. When it ended, the color had drained from his face. He immediately stood up, grabbed his jacket, and hurried toward the symposium hall. Inside the auditorium, Professor Ellison smiled confidently and prepared to deliver what he believed would be his final conclusion. He never noticed the side doors opening at the back of the room. The side doors opened so quietly that almost nobody noticed. A few heads turned, then quickly returned to the stage. The audience remained focused on Professor Richard Ellison as he adjusted his glasses and prepared to conclude his presentation. Confidence radiated from him. Years of teaching had given him complete command of a room. He knew exactly when to pause, exactly when to emphasize a point, exactly when to let silence reinforce his argument. The responsibility of a historian, he said, is not to preserve comforting stories. It is to preserve truth. The statement earned immediate applause. Not thunderous applause. Academic applause. Respectful. Certain. The kind that signals agreement rather than excitement. Ellison nodded graciously and allowed the sound to fade. Near the back of the auditorium, the university president stepped through the doorway. His arrival alone was unusual. The symposium was supposed to be routine. Yet he was not alone. Two men in dark suits followed several steps behind him. Their expressions remained neutral, professional, focused. The president scanned the room before settling his gaze on the elderly veteran seated near the front. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. Not confusion about who Thomas Whitaker was. Confusion about why nobody else seemed to understand. Emily Carter noticed the movement first. She turned in her seat and immediately recognized the tension in the president's posture. Something significant was happening. Her phone vibrated again. She looked down. Another message had arrived from Colonel James Harrington. The words were simple. Confirmation obtained. Archive verified. Emily felt her pulse jump. Verified. Not possible. Not probable. Verified. She slowly lifted her eyes toward Thomas. The old veteran remained exactly as he had been all afternoon. Calm. Patient. Almost detached from the storm forming around him. Professor Ellison continued speaking. Documentation exists for a reason, he said. Records survive because institutions preserve them. When no record exists, historians must acknowledge that reality. The giant screen behind him displayed another series of archive references. Rows of catalog numbers, government collections, historical repositories, evidence, or so everyone believed. 800 miles away, Colonel James Harrington stood inside a secure records room illuminated by cold fluorescent light. Several archive specialists surrounded a long steel table. The sealed Raven Hollow case now sat open. Document after document had been carefully removed. Flight logs, communications summaries, personnel records, operation maps. Harrington turned another page, then another. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Not only had the mission existed, Thomas Whitaker had been central to it. One archivist looked up from a file, visibly stunned. "Sir," he said quietly, "these reports should have been transferred decades ago." Harrington nodded slowly. They were never lost. The room fell silent. They were buried. Back at the university, the atmosphere remained unchanged for everyone except a handful of people who now understood the ground was shifting beneath them. The university president moved toward the front row. His pace quickened with each step. Several faculty members noticed him and exchanged puzzled looks. Why was he here? Why now? Emily watched him approach. So did the two men in dark suits. Neither spoke. Neither smiled. On stage, Professor Ellison clicked to his final slide. A single sentence appeared across the giant screen. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The audience began preparing for the conclusion. Not one of them realized that the evidence was already on its way, and it was moving far faster than anyone expected. Professor Richard Ellison stood before the final slide with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the discussion was over. The words behind him glowed brightly across the massive screen. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It was a line designed to end the debate, a line that summarized decades of academic discipline in a single sentence. The audience seemed satisfied. Students closed laptops. Several professors exchanged approving nods. A few people even began gathering their belongings. The symposium appeared finished. Then the university president reached the front row. He did not take a seat. He did not wait for the presentation to end. Instead, he leaned toward Thomas Whitaker and quietly introduced himself. The old veteran looked up with mild curiosity. Their brief exchange lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make nearby faculty members notice. Something felt wrong, or perhaps unusual was a better word. University presidents did not personally interrupt public lectures, especially not lectures that were proceeding exactly as planned. Emily Carter watched carefully. Her phone remained in her hand. Another message had arrived from Colonel James Harrington. Estimated arrival, 18 minutes. Emily read the words twice. 18 minutes. Whatever was coming was already moving. On stage, Ellison noticed the president near the front and paused. "Is everything all right?" he asked politely. The president forced a smile. "Please continue, Professor." The answer sounded normal. The expression on his face did not. Ellison hesitated before resuming. "As historians," he said, "our obligation is not to belief. It is to verification." The audience listened attentively. Yet the energy inside the room had shifted. Subtle, almost impossible to define. Conversations had stopped. People seemed to be waiting for something they could not identify. Thomas Whitaker remained completely still. His eyes drifted toward the cloth resting on the table. The faded fabric carried more years than many people in the room had been alive. The sight of it triggered another memory. Not a dramatic memory. Not a dangerous one. Just a quiet room illuminated by a single hanging lamp. Maps spread across a table. A young lieutenant carefully writing notes. Someone pouring coffee into metal cups. Rain tapping softly against a roof somewhere far away. Thomas remembered voices discussing routes, weather, and timing. Ordinary details. Yet those details had once mattered immensely. The memory faded as quickly as it appeared. Back in the present, he gently folded the cloth and placed it beside the satchel. Across campus, a black sport utility vehicle entered the university grounds. Behind it came another. Neither displayed government markings. Neither needed to. The security officer at the gate had already received instructions. Allow immediate access. No delays. No questions. Inside the vehicle sat individuals who rarely traveled for routine matters. One carried a locked document case across his lap. Another reviewed a printed briefing packet. Their destination was clear. Back in the archive facility, Colonel James Harrington stood beside the open Raven Hollow files. Every new document reinforced the same conclusion. Not a single piece of evidence contradicted Thomas Whitaker's account. In fact, the deeper they searched, the stronger the documentation became. Harrington closed one folder and looked toward his staff. How many supporting records now? An archivist checked a list. 37 confirmed documents, sir. Another archivist looked up from a computer terminal. And more are appearing in linked collections. Harrington nodded slowly. 37. The number alone was astonishing. Meanwhile, inside the auditorium, Professor Ellison smiled and prepared to answer audience questions. He believed he was standing on the strongest ground possible. He had no idea that 37 documents were already racing toward the very room where he stood. The first question from the audience never came. Professor Richard Ellison stood near the edge of the stage, ready to begin the discussion period, when movement at the back of the auditorium pulled attention away from him. It started subtly. A few people turned their heads. Then a few more. Conversations faded. Chairs stopped creaking. Something was happening near the entrance. The two men in dark suits who had entered earlier were no longer standing quietly against the wall. They were speaking with university staff. The university president had joined them. Whatever they were discussing appeared urgent. Ellison noticed the distraction and forced a polite smile. If everyone could remain focused, he said, lightly tapping the podium. We have time for questions. His voice carried through the room, but the spell had broken. Curiosity was spreading. Emily Carter looked toward the entrance again. Her phone vibrated once more. She already knew who the message was from. Arrival in 3 minutes. She read the words carefully. 3 minutes. Her eyes drifted toward Thomas Whitaker. He seemed completely unaffected. The old veteran sat with the same calm posture he had maintained throughout the afternoon. His satchel rested beside his chair. The folded cloth remained on the table. The room around him felt increasingly tense, yet he looked as though he were sitting on a quiet front porch watching the sun go down. The contrast was almost unsettling. Across the auditorium, faculty members began whispering among themselves. One professor leaned toward another. What is going on? He asked quietly. The other simply shook his head. Nobody knew. Outside, the low rumble of engines approached the building. Not loud, not dramatic, just noticeable enough that several people near the windows glanced outside. 2 black vehicles had stopped near the entrance. Doors opened. 4 individuals stepped out. Their pace was brisk but controlled, purposeful. They were not visitors looking for directions. They already knew exactly where they were headed. Back in Washington, Colonel James Harrington reviewed the latest archive summary while walking toward a waiting aircraft. The stack of verified records had grown even larger. More linked files had surfaced. More reports. More correspondence. More signatures. The deeper researchers dug, the clearer the picture became. Raven Hollow had never been a myth. It had been one of the most thoroughly documented operations Harrington had ever seen. The only unusual part was how effectively it had disappeared from public awareness. An aide hurried beside him. Sir, there is something else. Harrington accepted another folder. He opened it and stopped walking. The page contained a recommendation letter written decades earlier. A recommendation that had never been publicly released. At the bottom sat a familiar signature. Harrington stared at it for several seconds. Then he slowly closed the folder. That changes everything, he said quietly. Back at Jefferson State University, the side doors opened once more. This time, everyone noticed. The room gradually fell silent. One of the men who had arrived stepped inside, carrying a locked black document case. Another followed with a thick archive box secured by official seals. The university president immediately moved toward them. Even Professor Ellison stopped speaking. Something in the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to anticipation. Hundreds of eyes followed the newcomers as they walked steadily down the center aisle. The only person who did not seem surprised was Thomas Whitaker. He looked at the approaching case for a moment, then lowered his eyes, almost as though he already knew what was inside. And when the lead official finally reached the front row, he spoke only 6 words. Mr. Whitaker, we found the files. The words seemed to drain the air from the room. Mr. Whitaker, we found the files. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the faint hum of the projector suddenly felt louder. Professor Richard Ellison stood frozen beside the podium. The confidence that had carried him through the entire symposium faltered for the first time. He looked from the official to the black document case, then to the archive box resting in the man's hands. The seals were unmistakable. Federal. Authentic. Real. Around the auditorium, students exchanged confused glances. Faculty members leaned forward in their seats. Phones that had been put away moments earlier reappeared. Something extraordinary was unfolding. The lead official carefully placed the archive box on a nearby table. Beside it went the locked case. The university president stood close by, his expression tense and respectful. Not toward the officials. Toward Thomas Whitaker. That detail did not go unnoticed. Emily Carter watched everything with growing disbelief. She had expected confirmation. Perhaps a document. Perhaps a single record. She had not expected an entire archive box delivered in person. The lead official opened the case and removed several folders. Thick folders. Old folders. Their edges showed years of storage. He selected one and opened it. The audience sat in complete silence. The sound of paper turning seemed unusually loud. "We received verification from the National Military Archives," the official said. "The operation associated with the designation Raven Hollow has been confirmed." A ripple moved through the room. Not applause. Not conversation. Shock. Pure shock. Professor Ellison adjusted his glasses. "Confirmed," he repeated. The official nodded. Multiple independent records. Another folder opened. More documents appeared. Mission summaries. Another. Transportation logs. Another. Personnel assignments. The audience watched as the stack grew. Each new file seemed to make the room quieter. Professor Ellison stepped forward. His movements had lost their earlier certainty. "There must be some misunderstanding." The official looked directly at him. "There is no misunderstanding, Professor." Then he removed a photograph from one of the folders. A black and white image. Slightly faded with age. The room leaned forward collectively. The photograph showed a group of young service members gathered around a table covered with maps. One face had been circled decades ago in dark ink. The official held up the image. Thomas Whitaker. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the elderly veteran seated in the front row. The resemblance was unmistakable. Younger, stronger, but unmistakable. Thomas lowered his gaze. He did not smile. He did not appear triumphant. He simply looked tired. The kind of tiredness carried across decades. Another document emerged. Then another. Signatures. Coordinates. Reports. Correspondence. A chain of evidence stretching across years. Every page strengthened the same conclusion. The story was real. More than real. It had been documented repeatedly. Emily watched Professor Ellison's expression change with each document revealed. Not embarrassment. Something deeper. The realization that an assumption he had trusted completely was collapsing in real time. Then the official opened one final folder and paused. His eyes scanned the page. The room waited. Even Thomas Whitaker looked up. The official took a slow breath before speaking. "There is something else." The silence deepened. He carefully removed a single document and stared at the signature printed across the bottom. Then he looked directly at Thomas. "Sir," he said quietly, "I do not think anyone in this room understands who you actually are." The room remained completely silent after the official spoke. Nobody shifted in their seat. Nobody whispered. Even the students holding phones seemed to forget they were recording. The words hung in the air like a weight. "I do not think anyone in this room understands who you actually are." The official carefully placed the document on the table. His movements were deliberate, almost respectful. He looked at Thomas Whitaker before turning toward the audience. "This file was classified for decades," he said. "Not because the mission was insignificant. Quite the opposite." He opened the document and read from the first page. "Special Commendation Recommendation. Submitted following Operation Raven Hollow." His voice echoed softly through the auditorium. "Recommendation for exceptional leadership, operational planning, and successful extraction of personnel under extraordinary circumstances." Several professors exchanged stunned looks. The wording alone carried enormous weight. The official continued. "The recommendation was signed by 3 senior officers and forwarded for review." He paused and looked down again. The final endorsement came from a future chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A collective breath seemed to leave the room at once. Professor Richard Ellison lowered himself slowly into a nearby chair. The fight had left his posture. The certainty had disappeared from his expression. Years of research had taught him that documents mattered. And now the documents were speaking. The official turned another page. Mr. Whitaker declined public recognition. More silence. He declined interviews. Another page. He declined publication requests. Another. He declined every opportunity to publicly discuss the operation after classification restrictions were lifted. Emily Carter stared at Thomas in disbelief. The realization was difficult to process. He had never tried to prove himself, never tried to defend his reputation, never tried to build a legacy. He had simply told the truth when asked. Thomas looked down at his hands. The attention clearly made him uncomfortable. "Sir," the official said gently, "why did you never tell people?" Thomas remained quiet for several moments. The answer, when it finally came, was almost too simple. "Because the story was never about me." The words settled over the auditorium. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The old veteran glanced toward the folded cloth resting beside his satchel. "Most of the people who were there went home and built lives," he said softly. That mattered more than recognition. The official nodded. He understood. So did many others. Suddenly the records felt less important than the man sitting before them. Professor Ellison slowly stood. Every eye followed him. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. Not physically older. Humbled. He approached Thomas and stopped. The historian who had spent an afternoon dismantling a story now stood face to face with the man who had lived it. "Mr. Whitaker," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Thomas met his gaze. There was no anger in his eyes. No satisfaction. No victory. Only patience. The kind of patience earned through a long life. "You do not owe me anything, Professor," he replied. "You were looking for the truth." The room fell silent again. This time it was a different silence. Not tension. Respect. The official carefully closed the final folder. The archive box was sealed once more. The documents had done their job. They had proven every word. But as people slowly rose from their seats, many realized something unexpected. The most remarkable thing in the room had never been the files. It had been the man who never needed them. Thomas Whitaker picked up his old satchel, folded the faded cloth, and quietly walked toward the exit. No announcement followed him. No spotlight. No celebration. Yet every person in the auditorium stood aside and watched him pass. Some truths require evidence. Others reveal themselves through the character of the people who carry them. And on that afternoon, both arrived together.